So today I'll be talking about epistemology for international relations. This is critically important because as we get into more theorists, the major dividing lines will often be their epistemological stance because that will determine how they view the world inherently. And I'll need reference to this video when talking about those theories because epistemology can get hairy at times. I don't want to re-explain it every single time. I think most modern academics have no understanding of epistemology, while the golden age of IR theorists did have a strong understanding of epistemology. So I see them reference grand ideas in their work, and now those get misinterpreted by modern scholars who don't understand these ideas they're referencing, so they strawman them and misinterpret them and misunderstand them, etc. So in this video, I plan to set up a schema for epistemology for IR theorists. It's introductory. I'll be building off of what Jackson 2011 talked about, the work in my field on epistemology. The 90s were surrounded with debates around ontology, what things are. This seems rather strange to debate what things are when we don't even have a clear understanding of how to determine what knowledge is in the first place. Would be epistemology. I'll say that I think epistemology precedes ontology. So the setup of this video will be I'll explain what epistemology is. I'll move into what I think the major epistemologies are as far as breaking them up, and then I'll tie this all into international relations theory, and that'll be it. So we've got half an hour, but we'll see. So as far as what epistemology is, the problem set up for any of the philosophic branches are, you either have access inherently to a criterion, whether this be a criterion of knowledge, a criterion of ethics, a criterion of existential meaning. If you know the criterion, you can then look at different phenomena and say this meets the criterion or not. So if I think the criterion for knowledge is sense experience, well, if this right here is sense experience, I can say this is knowledge. If this is not a sense experience, I can say this is not knowledge, according to this criterion. There's many different criterion argued for epistemology. A second way of going about philosophy is I'll look at, I have all this phenomenon, I don't know the criterion, but I know this is true, I know this is false, I know this is true, I know this is false. I can then derive the criterion from these pieces of knowledge I have in the first place. So the fundamental difference between these two is if I know the criterion in advance for sure, and I'm looking at Bayes' equation up here. So Bayes' equation is essentially, mathematically, how we know what constitutes knowledge or not. It essentially says our prior belief times when it interacts with new data equals the probability that we should have a new belief. Which is to say, if my old belief can't account for new phenomenon I'm encountering, then I need to change my belief. However, if I think I have a methodology, some philosophic way of knowing the criterion in advance, then the way this equation shakes out is that the posterior will equal the prior and the data will be 1 because the data doesn't decrease any likelihood because I always can reinterpret the data with my criterion that I know in advance. But if I'm relying on phenomena I'm encountering to understand my criterion, well then I have my prior belief that I'm trying to understand this criterion with, but any new phenomena that I encounter will make me change my prior belief to a new belief. So it's essentially a sentimentality of whether you're willing to update your prior belief to new phenomena or whether you're just going to try to reinterpret the data through it. So dogmatism is in its essence taking a prior and then reinterpreting the data through the prior, or more nominalist view is that we always need to change our prior beliefs to new data. The dividing line is really a sentimentality. You can't really argue for one or the other. Mathematics is based off the equation. And we're going to see that in what I think are the 4 major categories of epistemology, at least as far as what is needed for IR goes. And I'll try to stay as plain spoken as possible in this discussion. It may get a little hairy as I'm setting it up, but I promise everything will be definitely explained as we go throughout the video. So the way Jackson 2011 sets this up, and I'll just copy him, I'll put a line in a second, is that over here we have a naturalist belief versus a transcendental belief. Transcendental. Spelling. So, transcendentalism is the idea that we can access experience or knowledge that we don't experience in the natural world. The natural world is what we are living in currently. The transcendentalists think that they have some methodology to access knowledge that we don't directly experience. This is not the same as a priori and posteriori. I, in my own personal formulation, put a priori here, posteriori here, but that requires a discussion that I don't want to have for this short video, what a priori knowledge is and what posteriori knowledge is. So I'm going with what Jackson 2011 said, and this is mind-body dualism. Dualism, it's awful. Dualism. And this is monism. So mind-body dualism is the Descartesian idea, or the Platonic idea, that we have a mind in some metaphysical space observing through our body. So that we are not necessarily a part of the natural world, we are observing it. While monism claims that we are within the natural world and we have to understand the natural world from being a part of it directly, with no access to any a priori knowledge. But if you believe in a priori knowledge, and you believe in dualism because you can access this other a priori space look at the world, you believe in just posteriori knowledge, for those that know what these are, then you're stuck in monism because you don't have access to this other realm of a priori knowledge. I'm going to go with this block, this block, this block, and this block, because that's how I'm going to use the equation up top to explain these four boxes in an illustrative way. So let's say I'm a transcendental dualist. Jackson 2011 calls this critical realism. Critical realism. This was the first time I encountered this term. I'd never seen it in my other philosophic studies before. Realism was a movement in the 10th century that tried to revive Plato. So it was basically 10th century had transcendental dualists versus naturalist monists. Would be William Ockham here, Aquinas up here. I'm just going to call it, for the sake of this video, rationalism, because that is generally what this block is thought of. This is Platonic, this is Descartesian. The general idea is that I can think of how the world's going to be in advance before coming to it, and then once I get to the world with my new belief, I can now understand all the data through it. Which is to say that the transcendental dualist or the rationalist believe they can think of a posterior distribution in advance, meaning that they think the data can only be reinterpreted, so that means the posterior is equal to the prior. Is essentially what the transcendentalists are saying, or the transcendental dualists are saying. So this would be vent up here. The general idea is that I'm going to think of structures that explain the natural world that I don't experience of. Vent's example is norms. I don't have direct experience of norms, but it is an idea that nonetheless seems to have some influence on the world. Norms, I don't have experience of them, but it has explanatory power for understanding the world. All of these three are disagreeing. All three are going to claim norms for themselves. But Vent claims that norms ought to belong in this category, hence this category is true. Not quite the argument, but simply put. Moving on to the naturalist dualist. So they believe we can only have knowledge from the natural world, but that we can observe the natural world in an unbiased way, which say in a way that we aren't constrained by the natural world, we aren't in it or watching it. This would be called the positivist school. Positivism. This was made, handwriting's awful. This is tragic for the viewer. I think I'm not the viewer. And there's also neo-positivism. So positivism and neo-positivism. This was made by Comte at the turn of the 19th century. Right, along the French Revolution, all that jazz. The general idea, as I already said, we're watching the world. This is what you think of traditional statistics. Most IR scholars nowadays are, unbeknownst to themselves, neo-positivists. This caused this branch, which is, I'll say 90% of scholars, to reinterpret all the arguments made in these three branches through their epistemology, because they don't even know they have this epistemology, so they misinterpret all three of these branches constantly. And it's very, very annoying for me. Because I'm not in this branch, I'm down here. So they always reinterpret my thoughts through their own thoughts. And I have to explain to them all of this before I can explain that I'm even here. It's painful. So most scholars are neo-positivists who believe they can objectively observe the world. This is to say they just outright use Bayes' equation. They have data. They have a prior about that data. They're going to test the data with the posterior. This will be what's known as the falsificationist approach. So Karl Popper proposed, he's a very famous positivist, probably the most famous, famous than Kant himself. He proposed falsification as the criterion for knowledge. So if a theory can't be falsified by the data we currently have, then it is true. For the time being, we have his critics later on. I'm going to be one of his critics in a second here, but that is his idea. So just, if you took any stats courses, you learn positivism. No. The interesting thing is positivism is mostly correlated with frequentism, which is your p-scores and p-values and all that jazz, while this is the Bayesian equation, which links more with pragmatism in my argument. The pragmatism is a naturalist monist view. Pragmatism. And pragmatism is confusing, because while we have rationality as your criterion for knowledge, we have hypothesis testing for criterion of knowledge. For pragmatism, what is pragmatic is your criterion for knowledge, which sounded very off-putting to me when I first reached it. I thought it sounded very stupid. But I've come around to be a pragmatist, in stretch of irony. So the pragmatists think that we are stuck in the natural world to start with. We can't access this mystical, magical realm of mind-body dualism where we look upon the world. We call that subjectivism. We think that if you're trying to think of stuff through your armchair and make predictions in the world, they're probably going to be wrong, and your beliefs are subjective, and you need to go fight these biases. So the way the pragmatist works, which is the way the number of the major theorists in our field are pragmatists, which is the problem, because everyone thinks they're up here, but they're not. When they're explicitly not up there, they're explicitly down here. So the way the pragmatists work is that we're looking for knowledge that meets an end. So while Popper up here is trying to falsify theories, people like Nietzsche said some of our most false beliefs are some of the most important beliefs to us. Now that's provocative, intentionally so, that's how he wrote. A more subtle way of putting it would be that, so if you look at a cognitive scientist like Gigerenz, who wrote most of this stuff in the late 90s, early 2000s, he essentially argued that heuristics opposed to algorithms. An algorithm solves something perfectly, takes a lot of time to do it. A heuristic is something quick. Heuristics, when it comes to uncertain data, make more accurate predictions than algorithms, which is to say that when your data is very hairy, biases are more accurate than not having biases, which is another way of saying that we have a theory. If we constrain the theory to what's known as a environment, is a special word for it. Essentially, you say we have a theory of war, a theory of war under these specific contexts. Though we could falsify this theory by pulling in data this theory wasn't meant to explain, which the neo-positives often do. It's like, oh, look at realism, it can't explain this phenomenon over in trade, hence it's false. That's the falsifications approach. The pragmatists say, no, this theory of realism is a good tool to use in this specific context. While the positivists want a very granular understanding of how something works, the pragmatists work something called an ideal type. Ideal type. You see a lot of neoliberals and neo-realists referencing ideal types, which is solely a pragmatist understanding. It comes from Max Weber, who was a naturalist monist, and the ideal type is saying we're going to make this rough generalization of the phenomenon, and it is your job as the practitioner to particularize this generalization to the specific phenomenon. Now the neo-positivists look at the generalization and say, well, no, I can falsify this generalization with this instance here, and this instance here. But they're completely missing the point of the ideal type, that it wasn't meant to explain the particular. You're supposed to particularize the ideal type to the particular. Now, if we're looking up at Bayes' equation about how monist naturalists work, because we are now stuck in the natural world, and we can't be unbiased, this has the unfortunate effect of making our data itself be problematic. We can no longer trust the validity of our data because now we're viewing all the data through a prior. So all our data depends on another prior that depends on more data. This is what is known as holism, coined by Quine. Not everybody that was a pragmatist used the word holism, they all kind of alluded to it. Quine really epitomized it in his book. I forget the book's name, but you can look it up, I'm sure. Quine is Quine. So now all our data depends on other data because we're seeing everything through a framework that is another prior biased belief. So we need to, while the naturalists believe that there's something known as a problem of underdetermination, and dualists fall prey to the problem of underdetermination. That essentially says that given any finite set of data, I can think of infinite ways to explain the data. Just rationally speaking, I always make ad hoc explanations to explain the data away. That's very clear with the rationalists because, a die-hard realist, a die-hard Marxist can always explain phenomena away through some weird ad hoc explanation. There's always a way to do it. It's mathematically proven. The only way to escape that is to have a clear prediction and then test it. The naturalists, or the neo-positivists in our field, have a strange aversion to making predictions half the time. They think they want to focus just on description and deny the possibility of prediction because they seem they can't do it. Well, they seem they can't do it because they're not doing pragmatic ways of making predictions. They're focusing on destroying all the tools that have predictive power. That is to say, predictive power is not the same thing as descriptive power. The positivists, so positivism works when it comes to the hard sciences because you don't have unpredictable, hairy data. When you have unpredictable, hairy data like you do in the social sciences, you need to have biased tools because biased tools are the ones shown to be most predictively accurate, which the pragmatists understand. Ideal types are inherently biased to one's way, and the way you get an ideal type, you can't use mind-body dualism to derive what an ideal type looks like. You have to be in the weeds, a monist that can't prove that the ideal type is correctly set up, but it works good enough to get the job done. And if there's a better ideal that comes along, great, but you have to show it through predictive accuracy, which these two don't really emphasize, but the monists really do emphasize predictive accuracy. And of course, Went says that the norms are what, the predictive accuracy, the explanatory power of the norms explain it, but then they say the predictive power of the norms justify being a critical realist. So, go up there again, all the data is chained. Quine's conclusion is that logic itself is a contingent phenomenon. Like William of Ockham, probably the first true naturalist monist, claimed that all data is contingent, including logic. He's called nominalism. It dominated academia for 2 centuries. It basically led to the scientific revolution, etc., etc. So even logic's up for, like if the rules of logic break down to a phenomenon, then we have to throw it out. We can't just say a priori that logic is true, because if we're stuck in a monist, we're stuck in the natural world with no escape. We can't have access to prove any of these things. Everything's just contingent, everything's probabilistic. While these guys want certainty, and then they can go beyond probabilistic and say this is for certain because we derived it with hard logic. The last branch is incredibly confusing to describe. It is very dubious. Few thinkers lie in here. This is known as reflexivism. It exists. It's extant. It came around in the 1990s in popularity in our field, and it has stuck with us. Reflectivism. This would be your critical theories. This would be your post-colonial theories. This would be your feminist theories. This would be anything of that chain. This is your postmodern theories. Because the general idea is that, yes, we're trapped in the natural world, but we have access to transcendental knowledge, which is a very strange thing to think about. So, reflexivism, because there's so many theories in it, it's even harder to describe than what positivism. Positivism is lots of theorists, and none of them agree with each other. Reflexivism is a whole grab bag of theories, but if I were to try to explain it using Bayes' equation, they would essentially come to the conclusion that they access data that only they in particular access, and that it has some explanatory power, and possibly even some predictive power, boy, they can access it, making it purely subjective. And there's a reason that all the reflexivist theories, the feminist theory, the post-colonial theories, the postmodern theories, all focus around power. Because they believe, well, if knowledge is simply something personal to me, that I have access to the transcendental. I mean, because I'm like when I'm honest, I can't a priori show that my knowledge is more correct than someone else's knowledge. Everything is purely subjective. And because the way we see knowledge is just the way my prior interprets the world, then our understanding itself is a power relation because my prior was probably forced upon me by someone else. And the way to persuade someone is to use power to force your understanding, your personal knowledge upon someone else. But at the end of the day, they're doing what the transcendentalist dualists are doing through a different realm. They still come up with the idea that they know the posteriori in advance, but because they have access to the prior knowledge. And that the knowledge experienced in the natural world is often greatly devalued compared to their own personal knowledge they have access to. Like they talk about like lived experience or stuff like that. Like there's a personal knowledge. You don't have access to it, but trust me, it's real. Is their general argument. So it all really comes down to power for them, a priori knowledge to them, of hypothesis falsification for them, and making predictions for the pragmatists. And of course, as I said, this is Vent. This is 99% of modern theorists nowadays. This would be Morgenthau, this would be Waltz, this would be Nye, this would be Keohane. They all, well, Morgenthau doesn't explicitly reference ideal types, but his philosophy is pragmatic. But Nye, Keohane, and Waltz all specifically reference their theory being ideal typed. And then this would be, as I said, the grab bag of all the postmodern theorists nowadays. And this is a brief introduction to what epistemology looks like in the field. It's hairy, but now I can make reference to this in the future. And hopefully, as I explain what theorists utilize each of these for in the upcoming videos, they'll make more sense.